Hello and welcome back to Forbat. Today we're going to be starting on a two-part series following on from my previous video, which is a casual introduction to error theory. But today we're going to be making a more formal case against objective morality. And next time we're going to start laying the foundations for a new type of egoism altogether to replace it with. But first I'll give a brief summary of last video. I started with something deceptively simple, and that is the idea of a need. We're often told that food and water are needs, whilst wine and leisure are wants. But look closely, what is a need? If you value survival, then you need food. If you value comfort, then you need medicine or companionship. But take away the goal, survival, comfort, whatever it may be, and the so-called need vanishes. So a need isn't an objective fact sitting out there in the cosmos. It's always tethered to what we want. And once you see that, the sharp line between needs and wants collapses. So now let's raise the stakes a bit. What about goodness? Well, when we call something good, we don't uncover a cosmic law written into the universe. We're expressing approval which is hammered into us by evolution, by culture, and by habit. Parents reward good behaviour, societies punish bad acts, and over generations this hardens into a moral conviction. It feels objective, that murder is wrong, that theft is bad, but what's really going on is projection. We're mistaking deeply ingrained instincts for cosmic truths. So here's the first unsettling move. Morality is not discovered, it is invented. Not eternal law, but a fiction. A story that gains its force by persuading us to act as though it was more than a story. And this is the doorway to error theory, the idea that moral discourse presupposes objective facts, but those facts do not exist. So, what is morality? Is it a spook, a myth, an error? Well, we're going to be testing the pill that the moralists hand us. Is it medicine? Is it a poison? Or is it just a placebo? But first let's dig deeper into J.L. Mackie's famous argument from queerness. In Ethics Inventing Right and Wrong, he says, if objective moral values did exist, they would be queer, that is, strange, unlike anything else we know in the natural world. And he means this in two distinct senses. Metaphysical queerness and epistemological queerness. Let's start with the metaphysical. What would it even mean for something to have an objective moral property? Imagine I say, this wall is blue. That's a natural property. The photons bouncing off it are at a wavelength of around 450 nanometers. You can measure that. Or, this chili pepper contains capsaicin. Again, a natural fact. Chemists can test it, scientists can observe it. Now ask, what happens when I say murder is wrong? I'm not just describing the event of killing, and I'm not just describing how people feel about it. I'm claiming that the act itself is carrying some intrinsic property, a kind of built-in wrongness that demands disapproval. And here's the really bizarre part. Moral properties are supposed to be intrinsically motivating. They don't just sit there in the world, they come with an inbuilt push. Think about how odd that is. Imagine if I said, this chili contains capsaicin, therefore you must eat it, no matter what you think about chili peppers. You'd laugh. That would be the classic is-ought fallacy. You're trying to pull a command out of a description, which is no better than pulling a command out of your arse. But moral claims try to do exactly this. Murder is wrong doesn't just describe the fact of killing, it's supposed to tell you what you must do about it, independent of your personal stance. Namely, you must not kill. That's metaphysically bizarre. A property that builds motivation into the very structure of reality, well, nothing else we know works like that. Now let's turn to the epistemology. If such a strange property existed, how could we ever know it? We know about photons by sight and instruments, and we know about chemicals by taste, smell, lab analysis. But how do we detect wrongness or rightness? Not by vision, not by sound, and not by ordinary reasoning. To access such properties, we'd need a special kind of faculty of moral intuition, a kind of sixth sense that tells us not just what is, but also what we must do. And that means a perception that's part fact detector, part motivation giver, something that reads the moral fabric of the universe and translates it directly into an action-guiding reason. And Mackie's saying, well, come on, this is just so nonsense. We have no evidence for such a faculty, and no reason to think we possess it. So Mackie's conclusion is a modest one but devastating. He says, if objective moral values existed, They'd be metaphysically and epistemologically bizarre, we have no evidence for them, and given Occam's razor, which is to not multiply entities beyond necessity, it's far simpler to say those properties just do not exist. Therefore, morality is not a discovery, it is a projection. Think of it like a rainbow. We can point and say the rainbow is out there in the sky, but in fact, it's not an object you can grab. It's a projection of light, droplets, and perspective. Likewise, wrongness and rightness are not properties woven into reality. They're outcomes of psychology, culture, and language. Richard Joyce, in The Myth of Morality, pushes this even further. He points to the problem of practical authority. So he says if murder is wrong were objectively true, then merely understanding it would give you an overriding reason not to murder, regardless of what you actually want to do. It's not just that you should be motivated, but on hearing it and agreeing with it, you actually would be motivated. And again, nothing in the universe works anything like this. Facts don't come built in with musts that make us feel compelled to act regardless of our feelings. And the epistemology gets even worse. To know such a fact, you'd need a magical detector, not just intuition, and not just recognizing truth, but being compelled by it, like you would be compelled by it. This stretches credibility just past breaking point. So Joyce is concluding now that every time we make a moral claim, we smuggle in the assumption of a categorical, irresistible reason. But since such reasons don't exist, given Occam's razor, every moral claim must be assumed to be systematically in error. So let's put this cleanly into a syllogism. Premise 1. If objective moral facts existed, they'd have to be intrinsically motivating and detectable by a special faculty. Premise 2. Nothing else in reality looks like that, and positing it is metaphysically extravagant. Premise 3. Occam's razor tells us not to posit extravagant entities without evidence. Premise 4. There is no such evidence. Therefore, no objective moral facts exist. So let's take this down to a concrete level. Let's consider the statement murder is wrong again. At first glance, it sounds like it's a binary. Murder must either be wrong or right. We're trained to think in binaries. If something isn't right, then it must be wrong, and if it isn't wrong, then it must be right. However, error theory, by investigating the true meaning of these sentences, shows us that that's a false framing, and here's why. When we say murder is wrong, what we are really claiming is something more like one ought not commit murder, which further means one has overriding reasons not to murder. But if objective moral reasons do not exist, and if there are no stance-independent reasons baked into the universe, then that claim collapses. So one has overriding reasons not to murder, that must be false. Also, therefore, one ought not murder is false, and therefore murder is wrong is false. Now this is where someone jumps in and goes, aha, well, the opposite must be true. Murder is right. If murder is not wrong, then murder is right. But here's the trap. The opposite of murder is wrong is not murder is right. Both of these claims are making the same false assumption, that there are moral properties out there in reality, wrongness and rightness, waiting to be attached to acts. But since those properties do not exist, both statements are false. So what's the real negation of murder is wrong? Well, it's simply murder is not wrong. And that's different. Murder is not wrong doesn't mean murder is right. It just means it's not the case. There's an overriding reason against murder. Likewise, murder is right is false. Murder is not right is true. Strange, isn't it? This does sound a bit counterintuitive, but again, that's because we're used to treating moral claims in an exhausted two-sided coin, right or wrong, good or evil. Error theory says neither side applies because the coin itself is counterfeit. So let's recap. Murder is wrong, false. Murder is right, false. They're both invoking moral qualities that don't exist. Murder is not wrong, i.e. it's not invoking a moral quality that doesn't exist. Murder is not wrong is true. Murder is not right is true. This looks odd because our habits of thought resist it. We want morality to divide the world neatly, but that neatness was always an illusion. Now, some philosophers saw the same problem as Mackie and Joyce, and they tried to solve it a little bit differently. They said, maybe moral claims aren't really about truth at all. Maybe they're not even the kind of statements that can be true or false. And this view is called non-cognitivism. According to the non-cognitivist, when someone says murder is wrong, they're not describing a fact about the world. What they're actually doing is expressing an attitude. They're really just saying something like boo murder or perhaps don't murder. So the words look like factual claims, but underneath they're more like cheers and boos at a sports game. And now, there's some appeal here, and there is some truth to this. We can all feel the emotional force of moral language. It is emotionally charged at the end of the day. If I say murder is wrong, that doesn't sound like I'm just neutrally reporting something like the capital of France is Paris. It feels charged, it's emotional, it's loaded. So non-cognitivism gets that part right. Moral language does carry passion with it. But here's the issue. Think of other situations where I'm booing or yaying. When I say boo Liverpool at a football match, I'm not pretending to make some universal claim. I'm not trying to give anyone else, i.e. the Liverpool fans, an overriding reason not to boo along with me. It's just my expressions of my internal feelings. But when someone says murder is wrong, they are speaking as if murder really does carry an objective property of wrongness that applies to everyone, whether they like it or not. And that's why error theory is the stronger account. It explains both the emotional weight and the appearance of objectivity, and also explains moral disagreement. Two sets of people are just wrong about the subject matter. Non-cognitivism explains only the emotional weight. It leaves out the crucial fact that moral language is trying to bind, to override, to compel. Here's another way to see it. Imagine a friend of yours casually just admits, by the way, I'm a serial killer and I've got one lined up tonight. Would you really just respond, oh, boo, murder? Well, no, that'd be absurd, wouldn't it? The very structure of moral language assumes that it carries authority, not just expression. Boo murder doesn't carry the expectation that they'll change their minds and not do the murder. And that's what the error theorist is capturing. Moral talk isn't just about booing and cheering, it's booing with a claim to cosmic authority, and because that authority doesn't exist, the moral claim turns out to be systematically false. So error theory has to win this round. It explains the emotional and the authoritarian aspects of moral language without reducing one to the other. Now, does this mean silence? Does this mean moral paralysis? No. Being an error theorist does not mean we stop having moral sentiments. Think about food. Taste is subjective, yet we still complain, this soup is bland, and people understand us perfectly. The fact that it's subjective does not rob the statement of its force. Likewise with morality, the statement, it is wrong to kill my mother, is strictly false, but it conveys a powerful sentiment, and because our tastes and our instincts are shaped by evolution and culture, most people share that sentiment. Morality then is better understood as a psychological manipulation. We don't just punish murderers, we also make them feel guilt, shame or remorse. That's the second layer, and that second layer is the morality part. So let's look at a syllogism. Premise 1. If a practice is used purely as an instrument to advance agents' non-moral aims, then using it does not commit one to objective moral facts. P2. Ethical discourse can be used purely as an instrument to advance such aims when another's action affects us. C1. Therefore, using ethical discourse does not commit one to objective moral facts. Premise 3. If engaging in a practice does not commit one to objective moral facts, then an error theorist can engage in it without contradiction. P4. Using ethical discourse does not commit one to objective moral facts. And C2. Therefore, an error theorist can engage in ethical discussion without contradiction. So therefore, error theory does not mean paralysis. It simply exposes morality as a human tool. So far we've seen Mackie and Joyce attack morality's truth from an analytic standpoint. They argue that it's false, that it presupposes properties that do not exist. However, we can go back even earlier to the 19th century to continental philosopher Max Stirner, and he adds a darker note. He tells us morality doesn't just misdescribe the world, it enslaves us. And to name this kind of enslavement, Stirner gives us a wonderfully eerie word, the spook. So what is a spook? Well, a spook for Stirner is just what happens when an idea, a human-made abstraction, gets mistaken for a higher truth, a master above us. Think of chess. The rules of chess are a human invention, and we all know this. If tomorrow we decided that pawns could move backwards, the game would still go on. But imagine we convinced ourselves that the rule of chess was sacred, written into the universe itself, discovered by chessologists. Imagine believing that you must play the one true way, even if it ruined your enjoyment or harmed your interests. At that point, playing chess has become the spook. The rules we created now rule us. And this is exactly what happens with morality. People mistake their own inventions, good, evil, duty, virtue, for cosmic categories. They believe that these abstractions bind us, whether we will it or not. They even sacrificed their desires and interests and even their lives in obedience to the phantom. And morality is not alone. Stirner points out that nations, races, traditions, humanity itself are all guilty partners. These are not living human beings, they are abstractions. But people march to war and die for them anyway. God, justice, freedom, lofty words often treated as masters rather than tools. Even something like the non-aggression principle in anarcho-capitalism, treated by its defenders as a stance independent, natural, untouchable, sacred law, that too is a spook. So notice the structure here. First, we create the idea. Second, we reify it. We treat it as if it exists independently of us. And then third, we bow down to it, even sacrificing ourselves to it. And that is how you create a spook. We end up owned by our own invention. As Stirner puts it, we become possessed by it, like a ghost in our head. So let's give an example to drive it all home. A soldier is told to die for his country. He obeys, believing the nation is a higher reality than his own body and life. But the nation is only a concept, an idea in his head. He dies for a ghost. A person rejects love or joy because their religion calls it sinful. They renounce their own flesh and blood, not for another human being, but for a God they've never met. A worker endures exploitation because they believe in the sacredness of duty or hard work. They hand over their hours and energy to an idol that exists only in language. And this, for Stirner, is the true horror of morality. Error theory says morality is false. Stirner says, and worse, it rules us like a phantom master. So morality is not just an error of thought, it's an error of ownership. We invent it, but then it owns us. Stirner's egoism says that spooks must be exorcised. Instead of being ruled by abstractions, we recognize them as our own creations, as our property, not as sacred laws, but tools we can take up or discard. Stirner doesn't reject socialism, Stirner rejects sacred socialism. I can play chess when it suits me, drop it when it doesn't. I can use the idea of justice as a rhetorical weapon, but refuse to worship it. The egoist reclaims ownership, no ghost commands him. So far, this is where the demolition stands. Mackie shows that morality, as an objective truth, would be metaphysically and epistemologically queer, and Joyce shows that the morality's assumption as overriding irresistible reasons is false. And Stirner goes even further and shows that morality doesn't just misdescribe reality, it also enslaves us with ghosts of our own making. Together, these thinkers strip morality of both truth and authority. And this is where we turn next time to the reconstruction of morality in part 2. But I'm going to leave that there for sake of time. For now, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. Any criticism so far, any comments, leave them in, the comment section. But for now, I'll see you later.